Imagine standing on the northern edge of Australia 65,000 years ago. The sun is rising over an ocean that looks nothing like the one we know today. Sea levels are lower, much lower. Islands that are now separated by deep water are connected by land bridges, or separated by narrow channels you could almost swim across. The air smells different. Salt and smoke and something wild. And then you see them. Boats. Not rafts, not driftwood, actual watercraft coming across the horizon. Inside are people who have just done something no human has ever done before. They've crossed open ocean to reach a shore that no member of our species has ever touched. They're carrying tools, fire, children, stories. They're carrying the future. This moment, this arrival, is one of the most extraordinary events in human history. And for most of the last century, almost everything we were told about it was wrong. If you went to school before the year 2000, you probably learned that Aboriginal Australians were latecomers to the human story. Primitive, isolated, living in a Stone Age time capsule while the rest of humanity moved forward. You might have been taught they arrived maybe 40,000 years ago, maybe less, that they had simple tools, no real technology, no agriculture, no writing, that they represented an earlier stage of human development, frozen in time. Every single part of that story is being demolished by new science. And I mean demolished. We're not talking about minor corrections or updated dates. We're talking about a complete reimagining of who Aboriginal Australians are when they arrived, what they achieved, and what their story means for understanding all of humanity. In 2025, a massive genetic study analysed DNA from nearly 2,500 people across Australia and New Guinea. The results pushed the arrival date back to around 60,000 years ago, maybe 65,000. That's not a small adjustment. That's rewriting the timeline, but it gets better, or more shocking depending on how you look at it. Archaeological sites like Majedbi Bay and Arnhem Land have produced over 100,000 artefacts, seed-grinding stones that are the oldest in the world, ground-edge axes, sophisticated pigments, evidence of plant processing and complex tool-making, all dated to 65,000 years ago. These aren't primitive survivors scraping by. These are innovators, engineers, artists, arriving with technology that wouldn't appear in other parts of the world for tens of thousands of years. The old narrative said Aboriginal Australians were isolated and unchanging. The new science says they were seafaring pioneers, genetic trailblazers carrying Denisovan DNA that shaped human evolution, custodians of the world's oldest continuous cultures, and inventors of technologies we're only now beginning to understand. Before we go further, if you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love checking comments. It's like Tokyo at dawn and Toronto at midnight, all at once. This is a story about deep time, about human ingenuity at the edge of the world, about how science, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge are finally converging to tell the truth. And the truth is so much more interesting than the lie ever was. So let's dismantle the old story, piece by piece, and build something better in its place. So where did the old story come from? How did we end up with such a completely wrong picture of Aboriginal Australians for so long? The answer isn't just bad science. It's worse than that. It's science built to serve an agenda. Picture this. It's 1770, and Captain Cook's ship, the Endeavour, sails into Botany Bay. The British crew encounters Aboriginal people for the first time. They're watching a functioning society, complex kinship systems, sophisticated land management, tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. But that's not what they write down in their journals. They see people with different tools, different clothes, different ways of living, and they make a decision that will echo for centuries. These people, they conclude, are primitive, the lowest stage of human development. Within a few decades, European scientists were building entire theories around this idea. They invented racial hierarchies, literal ladders of human worth with Europeans at the top and Aboriginal Australians near the bottom. They measured skulls, compared bone structures, used pseudo-scientific methods like craniometry to argue that Aboriginal people were closer to apes than to civilized man. This wasn't fringe thinking. This was mainstream science in the 18th and 19th centuries. By the mid-1800s, social Darwinism was providing a convenient new framework. Darwin's ideas about natural selection, brilliant when applied to biology, got twisted into something hideous when applied to human societies. Aboriginal Australians were labelled a dying race, unfit in the struggle for existence. In Western Australia and elsewhere, this rhetoric wasn't just academic. It became official policy. It shaped how governments treated Indigenous people, how land was taken, how children were stolen. But perhaps the most persistent myth was the idea of the living fossil. European anthropologists convinced themselves that Aboriginal Australians had simply stopped evolving. They'd arrived in Australia tens of thousands of years ago, and then just frozen in time, unchanged, offering a convenient window into what early humans must have been like everywhere. Stone Age survivors, a glimpse of humanity's past, preserved like an insect in amber. This narrative was incredibly seductive to European scientists because it made their job easy. Want to know what Paleolithic Europeans were like? Just study Aboriginal Australians. They're exactly the same as they were 50,000 years ago, right? Except they weren't. They never were. The whole premise was fantasy. By the 20th century, textbooks were repeating variations of the same tired script. Aboriginal people grew nothing, built nothing, stayed nowhere long. No agriculture, no metal, no writing, no architecture, no domesticated animals. Therefore, no civilization. Therefore, no history worth studying. The logic was circular and deeply flawed, but it became accepted wisdom. Kids in Australian schools learned that their continent had been essentially empty before Europeans arrived. Terra nullius, land belonging to no one. This wasn't just insulting, it had real consequences. If Aboriginal people had no civilization, no history of land use, no complex society, then taking their land wasn't theft. It was progress. If they were doomed to extinction anyway, victims of their own inability to adapt, then assimilation policies weren't destruction of cultures. They were mercy. This thinking justified everything from land dispossession to the forced removal of children that became the stolen generations. The science and the politics were inseparable. The myths served colonial interest perfectly, and they persisted far longer than they should have. But then something started to change. In the 1950s and 60s, archaeologists like John Mulvaney began doing systematic excavations in southeastern Australia. What they found didn't match the static, unchanging picture. They found long sequences of technological change, evidence of adaptation and innovation over thousands of years. Tools evolving, settlement patterns shifting, people responding creatively to environmental changes. At the same time, Aboriginal activists were beginning to challenge the narrative directly. Land rights movements, cultural revival, demands for recognition. Indigenous voices that had been ignored for centuries were finally being heard, at least by some people. The combination of new archaeology and Indigenous advocacy started cracking the foundation of the old story. By the 1970s, it was becoming impossible to sustain the primitive myth in academic circles, though it would take decades more for that to filter into popular consciousness, and some people still cling to it today. But the evidence kept piling up, and it told a very different story, not one of stasis, but of extraordinary adaptation. Not primitives, but innovators. Not a people frozen in time, but a people who had been changing, surviving, and thriving for longer than almost any other human population on Earth. That's the story we're about to explore, and it starts with a question nobody was asking in 1770. When did they really arrive? When did they really arrive? That question sounds simple, but the answer requires you to think in timescales that make recorded history feel like yesterday's news. We're talking about deep time, not centuries, not even millennia. We're talking about tens of thousands of years, timescales so vast that entire ice ages come and go, coastlines shift by hundreds of miles, and the very shape of continents transforms. For most of the 20th century, the accepted answer was relatively recent, maybe 20,000 years, perhaps 30,000 at most. But every new excavation pushed that date back further. By the 1990s, archaeologists were finding sites reliably dated to 40,000 years, then 45,000. The timeline kept stretching backward like elastic under tension. Then came Majid Bebe. Picture a sandstone rock shelter in Arnhem Land, in Australia's far north. It's Mirarr country, traditional lands of the Mirarr people who've known about this place forever. To archaeologists, it's a site that's been excavated multiple times, first in 1973, then major campaigns in 1989, 2012, and 2015. Each time they dig, they go deeper, and each time they keep finding human occupation layers under what they'd previously thought was the bottom. The 2015 excavation went deeper than ever before, down through layers of sand and sediment, each stratum carefully documented, each artifact precisely mapped. They used optically stimulated luminescence dating, a technique that measures when sediment grains were last exposed to sunlight, effectively dating the layers themselves. What they found stopped everyone cold. The earliest occupation layer, the very bottom of human presence at this site, dated to around 65,000 years ago. Give or take a few thousand years for measurement uncertainty, but the number was clear. People had been living at Majid Bebe for at least 50,000 years, possibly 65,000. But here's what made archaeologists really pay attention. This wasn't just a few scattered tools marking a brief visit. This was a rich archaeological deposit packed with thousands of artifacts, ground-edge stone axes, some of the earliest examples anywhere in the world, grinding stones showing wear patterns from processing seeds and plant materials, stone points for spears or cutting tools, and ochre. Lots of ochre. Not just raw ochre either. These people were processing it, grinding it, mixing it with other materials. They'd combined red ochre with crushed reflective minerals, probably mica, to create pigments that would catch the light. This isn't survival technology. This is art. This is aesthetic choice. This is people who had the mental bandwidth to care about making something beautiful. From the very earliest layers, from 65,000 years ago. So you have sophisticated tool technology, systematic plant processing, and symbolic or aesthetic material use all present from day one of the archaeological record. These weren't people just learning to adapt to a new continent. These were people who arrived with a complete complex cultural toolkit already developed. But not everyone was convinced. As soon as those dates were published, the debate started. Some archaeologists argued that Majid Bebe's sandy sediments might have been disturbed. Termites are incredibly active in tropical Australia, constantly moving soil particles around as they build their tunnels and chambers. Could artifacts from younger layers have been carried down into older sediments, making everything look older than it really was? The excavation team addressed this carefully. They documented the stratigraphy in meticulous detail, looking for signs of disturbance. They'd used multiple independent dating methods. They'd analysed how artifacts were distributed vertically through the layers. Their conclusion was that while some minor mixing might have occurred, the broad pattern was solid. Humans were at Majid Bebe by at least 50,000 years ago, probably closer to 60,000 or 65,000. The conservative position settled on roughly 50,000 to 55,000 years as the minimum age everyone could agree on. Even the skeptics accepted that, and that's still extraordinary. That still makes Aboriginal Australians one of the oldest continuous populations outside Africa. But then genetics caught up with archaeology. In 2025, researchers published a massive study of mitochondrial DNA. Not a few dozen samples, not even a few hundred. 2,456 complete mitochondrial genomes from Indigenous Australians and Papuans, plus supporting data from Y chromosomes and whole genomes. They built family trees showing how these genetic lineages were related, then used molecular clock methods to estimate when they'd split from other human populations. The answer came back clear. Around 60,000 years ago, right in the middle of Medjedbeb's date range. Suddenly archaeology and genetics were telling the same story. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans had separated from other human groups roughly 60,000 to 65,000 years ago and made their way to Sahul, the combined supercontinent that Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania formed during the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower. The genetic study revealed something else too. There weren't one migration route. There were at least two. One group seems to have travelled south through the Philippines and Sulawesi, crossing water gaps to reach what's now northern Australia. Another took a more northerly route into New Guinea. Both groups were moving at roughly the same time, both successfully crossing substantial stretches of open ocean, both establishing populations that would endure for the next 60,000 years. These weren't accidental drift voyages. These were deliberate journeys by people who understood boats, navigation, and how to survive a sea crossing. The fact that multiple groups succeeded independently suggests this was established knowledge, not lucky accidents. So where does that leave us? Even if you take the most conservative position, even if you're skeptical of the oldest Medjedbeb dates, you're still looking at continuous human presence in Australia for at least 50,000 years. That's 2,000 generations. That's twice as long as modern humans had been in Europe. That's longer than Neanderthals survived after modern humans arrived in their territories. And if the longer chronology is right, if those 65,000-year dates hold up, then Aboriginal Australians were establishing complex societies in Australia, while most of the rest of the world was still empty of modern humans, while Europe was still Neanderthal territory, while the Americas wouldn't be reached for another 45,000 years. Think about that timeline. 65,000 years of continuous presence. 65,000 years of accumulated knowledge, technological refinement, cultural development. That's not a people without history. That's a people with more history than almost anyone else on Earth. But they didn't just arrive and settle down. What they did next was even more remarkable. They were about to meet the strangest, most dangerous creatures that had ever existed. And somehow they would survive the encounter. So they made it. 60,000 years ago, humans stood on the shores of Sahul. But here's what most people miss. That sentence, "they made it," hides one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history. Because getting to Sahul wasn't a matter of walking. It wasn't a gradual expansion following game animals across continuous land. It required something that almost no other species had ever managed: deliberate, planned, open ocean voyaging. Let's set the scene properly. During the Ice Age, when global sea levels dropped as water got locked up in massive ice sheets covering the northern continents, the geography of Southeast Asia and Australia looked radically different than today. Sea levels were maybe 120 metres lower than present. That's enough to expose vast areas of continental shelf. In Asia, the Sunda Shelf emerged as dry land, connecting the Southeast Asian mainland with Borneo, Java and Sumatra into one extended continent called Sunda. Animals could walk from what's now Thailand all the way to Java without getting their feet wet. In the south, Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea and the Aru Islands, merged into a single enormous landmass called Sahul. If you were standing in what's now the Torres Strait, you'd be hundreds of miles inland. But between Sunda and Sahul lay Wallacea, a chain of deep-water islands that never connected to either continent, no matter how far sea levels dropped. These islands sat above ocean trenches thousands of meters deep. When the Ice Age exposed the continental shelves, Wallacea remained a barrier, a series of islands separated by stretches of open ocean, and here's where it gets serious. To reach Sahul from Sunda, humans had to cross Wallacea multiple times. Computer models reconstructing Ice Age geography show that even with sea levels at their absolute lowest, getting from Sunda to Sahul required somewhere between 8 and 17 separate water crossings depending on your route. Some of these crossings were short, maybe 10-15 kilometers of water between visible islands, but at least one crossing, no matter which route you took, stretched over 70 kilometers. 70 kilometers of open ocean, no land in sight once you left shore. Just you, your boat, your companions, and an ocean that could kill you 100 different ways. For context, no non-flying mammals except humans ever made these crossings naturally, not during the entire Pleistocene epoch. The islands of Wallacea have their own unique fauna because animals from Asia couldn't reach them. The Wallace Line, the invisible boundary between Asian and Australian biogeographic zones, runs right through Wallacea, marking where Asian species stopped spreading because they couldn't cross the water gaps. Except humans did it, and they did it at least 60,000 years ago, probably earlier. Now the old story, the one you might have learned in school, suggested a single coastal migration. People following the Asian coastline, maybe island hopping when they had to, eventually reaching northern Australia through some single point of entry. Simple, linear. One founding population making one journey. The genetic evidence says something completely different. That 2025 study of 2,400 plus genomes revealed at least 2 major migration corridors operating at roughly the same time. One group came south through the Philippines and Sulawesi, making their crossings through the northern island chains before reaching what would become the northern coast of Sahul. Another group took a more southerly route through southern Indonesia, crossing the water gaps toward northwestern Australia. Both routes worked. Both populations survived the crossings and established themselves in Sahul. Both contributed to the genetic ancestry of modern Aboriginal Australians and Papuans. The pattern suggests not one heroic journey, but multiple deliberate expeditions by different groups who all understood how to cross open ocean successfully. Think about what that requires. First, you need boats, not logs you cling to, not rafts that drift wherever currents take them. You need watercraft capable of carrying multiple people, plus provisions across dozens of kilometers of open water. Watercraft you can steer, control, direct toward a destination you might not even be able to see from your starting point. Building boats like that requires accumulated knowledge. You need to understand which materials work, how to shape them, how to make them watertight, how to create something stable enough that it won't capsize in ocean swells. Bamboo rafts lashed with plant fiber, bark canoes, dugout vessels. We don't know because wood doesn't preserve for 60,000 years in tropical environments, but we know they had something that worked. Second, you need navigation. Crossing 70 kilometers of open ocean means understanding currents, winds, how to maintain direction without landmarks. You probably need to know about seasonal weather patterns, when conditions are favorable for crossing. This isn't knowledge you pick up in an afternoon. This is intergenerational expertise, passed down through teaching and practice. Third, you need group coordination. Population genetics tells us that viable founding populations couldn't be just a few individuals. You need breeding populations large enough to avoid inbreeding, depression and extinction. That means coordinating voyages with multiple boats, multiple families, enough people to establish a sustainable community on the other side, and you need provisioning. Fresh water for a journey that might take days, food that won't spoil, maybe fire-making equipment carried in waterproof containers so you can make fire on arrival, tools, seeds or cuttings if you're planning to cultivate plants in your new home. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing disaster. These were organised expeditions by people who planned ahead. All of this 60,000 years ago. Compare that globally. Regular long-distance seafaring in the Mediterranean, people crossing from the mainland to places like Crete, doesn't show up in the archaeological record until maybe 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. Systematic ocean voyaging in the Atlantic comes even later. When Aboriginal ancestors were crossing Wallacea into Sahul, they were pioneering maritime technologies that wouldn't be matched in other parts of the world for another 40,000 years. They weren't primitive, they weren't simple. They were among the most sophisticated seafaring peoples in human history, and they were doing it at the dawn of modern human expansion, when our species was still finding its way in the world. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. They didn't just make these crossings once. The genetic evidence shows multiple pulses of movement, ongoing contact between populations, continued exchange across Wallacea even after initial settlement. These sea routes remained active. Knowledge of how to cross them was maintained and used repeatedly. When your ancestors finally stepped onto the shores of Sahul, they weren't lost. They weren't lucky survivors of an accidental drift. They were explorers who'd successfully executed one of the most challenging journeys any humans had yet attempted. They'd crossed an ocean barrier that no other species had ever breached, and they were about to discover a continent unlike anything they had ever seen. The first thing they would have noticed was the smell. Not the salt of the crossing anymore, but earth. Hot, sun-baked dust and crushed plants, the heavy musk of animals on the wind. And then, as they pushed inland, something stranger. A dung smell, but not like anything from Asia or Africa. Richer, sharper. The scent of an animal they had never seen before, because nothing like it existed anywhere else on Earth. Ice Age Sahul was not a quiet, empty land waiting to be claimed. It was already full of creatures that looked like they'd stepped out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on how close you were standing. Imagine walking out onto an open plain and seeing what, at first, you think is a rhinoceros. Big, barrel-bodied, lumbering towards a waterhole. But then you look closer. Its head is wrong. There's no horn. The face is soft, wombat-like, with a broad muzzle perfect for stripping shrubs. This is Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived. 2, maybe 3 tons of wombat relative, as heavy as a small truck moving slowly through the scrub. In the distance something bounces. At first you think, kangaroo. You know that shape from your own savannah back home. Long legs, bounding gait. But this one doesn't hop like the wallabies you'll meet later. It stands upright, heavy, short-faced, almost like a muscular deer that's decided to balance on 2 legs. Sthenurus, one of the giant kangaroos, up to 3 meters tall. It doesn't need to use its tail for balance the way modern kangaroos do. It just stands, massive, chewing leaves, watching you. Close to the tree line, the air cools and darkens. You hear something moving in the underbrush, not heavy like Diprotodon, smoother, a sliding muscular whisper over leaf litter. When it emerges, your brain scrambles to categorize it. Lizard? Yes, but bigger than any lizard has any right to be. 5, maybe 6 meters from nose to tail, thick as a man's chest, covered in rough scales. This is Megalania, or Varanus priscus, a giant monitor lizard related to modern Komodo dragons. Its mouth is full of bacteria-rich saliva. One bite could mean a slow, painful death, And then there are the hunters. You hear a cough behind you, almost cat-like, but there are no big cats here. You turn and see a stocky animal with powerful shoulders, short head, slicing teeth driven by bone-crushing jaw muscles, thylacoleo, the so-called marsupial lion. It's not a lion at all, but it fills the same ecological role. An ambush predator capable of dragging down animals much larger than itself. Its hands have retractable claws, perfect for climbing, grabbing, killing. On the open plains, huge birds stride through the grass, taller than any human, ginormous in its kin, flightless, heavy-bodied, like a cross between an emu and a locomotive, eggs the size of melons, legs built for running and kicking, not for escape into the sky. Nothing here quite fits the templates your ancestors brought from Africa and Asia. No horses, no antelopes, no big cats. Instead, a parallel evolutionary experiment. Marsupial elephants without trunks, wombats the size of hippos, kangaroos that don't hop, lizards as long as a small boat, birds too big to fly. This is the world the first Australians entered. Now there's an old, simple story that used to be told about what happened next. It goes like this. Humans arrived, and the megafauna vanished. We turned up with fire and spears, and within a few centuries everything big was gone. Case closed. The actual evidence is slower, messier, more interesting. Archaeological sites like Warratia in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia show people living in inland rock shelters at least 49,000 years ago. In the same layers, you find bones from animals like Diprotodon and other large marsupials. Not a single kill site, not a single catastrophic event, but a record of humans and giants sharing the same landscapes for thousands of years. Other places tell similar stories. At Cuddy Springs in New South Wales, megafauna bones and human stone tools lie mixed together in sediments dated roughly between 40,000 and a bit over 30,000 years ago. No sharp line where one ends and the other begins, just a long overlapping coexistence. In the Willandra Lakes region, giant browsing marsupials like Zygomaturus seem to have survived until around 33,000 years ago. If people reached Sahul somewhere around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, as the latest genetic and archaeological work suggests, then in some areas humans and megafauna were together on the same country for maybe 10,000, 15, even 20,000 years or more. That doesn't look like instant extermination. It looks like a relationship, complex, changing, uneven across time and space. So what did actually happen to the giants? Scientists don't fully agree. Some see a relatively rapid wave of extinction soon after human arrival, especially in certain regions. They argue that even low levels of hunting pressure on slow-reproducing animals like Diprotodon could tip them over the edge. A few extra deaths each year, generation after generation, and the population never recovers. Others point out that Australian megafauna had been living through climatic instability for hundreds of thousands of years before any humans showed up. The late Pleistocene was trending drier, more variable. Inland lakes shrank or disappeared. Grasslands and open woodlands shifted, then shifted again. For big specialized animals, this meant stress long before the first spear was thrown. From that perspective, humans weren't a single fatal blow, but another pressure layered onto environments already under strain. Hunting, yes, in some places. Competition for waterholes. Perhaps the burning of habitats those giants relied on. But also long-term changes in rainfall patterns and vegetation driven by orbital cycles and greenhouse gas fluctuations. The safest thing we can say is that extinction was almost certainly not caused by one simple factor everywhere. In some regions, human hunting may have accelerated declines. In others, shifting climate and shrinking wetlands might have pushed species over the edge even with relatively little direct human contact. Different animals, different ecologies, different endings. But there's another part of the story that matters just as much as the question of who killed the giants. And that's how Aboriginal ancestors began shaping the very landscapes those giants lived in. From very early on, people in Sahul weren't just reacting to their environment, they were managing it. One of the most important tools they used wasn't a spear or an axe, it was fire. You've probably heard the term fire stick farming. It doesn't mean ploughs and fences. It means knowing exactly when to walk out into country with a smouldering branch and where to drop that flame. Small, cool burns at the right time of year. Not random infernos, but careful, patterned burning. Burn a patch of grassland, and a few weeks or months later, when the rains come, fresh green shoots appear. Herbivores love those shoots. Kangaroos, wallabies, smaller marsupials all concentrate there. For hunters, that's like building a movable, renewable pantry. Over years and centuries, repeated burning on this fine scale creates mosaics, patches of young, open regrowth next to older, denser scrub, pockets of woodland shading creek lines, grassy corridors that animals learn to travel. It can increase the abundance of certain food plants. It can make walking easier and safer, and, as many fire ecologists point out, it can reduce the build-up of dry fuel that feeds catastrophic, high-intensity wildfires. Not every researcher agrees on how much these practices change the whole continent. When scientists look at charcoal in lake sediments and cave deposits, the big long-term patterns of fire still tend to track climate. Drier times mean more charcoal, wetter times less. That suggests cultural burning sat on top of and modulated a climate-driven baseline rather than completely overriding it. But even if you see fire stick farming as a local modifier, rather than a continental switch, it still tells us something crucial. People in Sahul were not simply living off the land in some passive, untouched wilderness. They were actively curating it, encouraging some species, opening up some areas, letting others regenerate, and they were doing this while learning to live in some of the most varied environments on the planet. In the tropical north, monsoon rains flooded wetlands and river plains. People there learned the timing of fish migrations, the fruiting of rainforest trees, the behavior of crocodiles. They wove their movements and ceremonies around wet and dry seasons that could swing from abundance to scarcity in a few weeks. Further south and inland, in places like Warratee, life meant mastering arid ranges and desert margins. Waterholes that might last all year in good seasons could vanish in bad ones. Food was scattered, shifting with rare rains. Here, ecological knowledge had to be incredibly precise. Which plants held moisture, which animals you could track by the faintest sign, where to find shelter when the wind carried dust for days. At the far southern edge of Sahul, in what would become Tasmania, people eventually faced glacial cold. Ice on nearby peaks, bitter winds, short, hard winters. They adapted their clothing, their shelters, their hunting strategies. They shifted with retreating and advancing ice, tracking wallabies and other cold-adapted species through forests that would one day be drowned, as sea levels rose and Tasmania was cut off from the mainland. Same ancestors, same broad genetic toolkit forged in that ancient bottleneck. Completely different worlds. The common thread through all of this is agency. The first Australians were not simply at the mercy of giant beasts and changing climates. They were from the very beginning experimenters, fire managers, route planners, story keepers who encoded the behavior of animals and the breathing of landscapes into songs and narratives we'll talk about later. The Megafauna story, in other words, is not just a story about extinction. It's a story about relationship and transformation, about humans entering a continent already full of giants, living alongside them for thousands of years, and gradually becoming the dominant ecological force, not just by killing, but by knowing, by burning, by moving with the seasons in ways that reshaped the very patterns of life around them. And those relationships with older human cousins didn't end at the shoreline. The same people navigating this new world of wombat rhinoceroses and marsupial lions were also carrying within their bodies a legacy from another lineage entirely, a ghost population whose DNA still runs strongly in Aboriginal Australians and Papuans today. To understand who those ghosts were and what they left behind, we have to step back out of Sahul for a moment, into the deep genetic shadows of Asia. The first time scientists met the Denisovans, they didn't even know what they were looking at. It was just a fragment, a small bone from the tip of a child's finger, found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Cold, high country, snow on the ridges much of the year. The cave already had a reputation. Neanderthal fossils had come out of its sediments. Stone tools littered its floors. Nobody expected that tiny bone to rewrite the map of human ancestry. When geneticists ground a bit of it to powder and pulled out DNA, what they found didn't match anything they'd seen before. It wasn't Neanderthal, it wasn't modern human, it was something else. A sister lineage to Neanderthals, branching off from the same ancient trunk, but then following its own path for hundreds of thousands of years. They named this shadowy group after the cave, Denisovans. For a long time, that's all we had. A child's finger bone, a few huge teeth, a fragment of jaw from the Tibetan plateau, later recognized as Denisovan too. No complete skull, no full skeleton, no campsite with a sign saying Denisovan slept here. And yet, as more genomes were sequenced, especially from people across Asia and the Pacific, a strange pattern emerged. The Denisovans might be almost invisible in the fossil record, but in DNA they were everywhere, especially in one part of the world. When researchers began comparing whole genomes from living Papuans, Aboriginal Australians and their neighbours against the Denisovan reference genome from that Siberian cave, they saw something remarkable. Long stretches of DNA in these modern people matched Denisovan sequences much more closely than they matched other modern humans. Not just a little. Enough that, in some Papuan and Melanesian groups, roughly 4 to 6% of the genome appears to come from Denisovan ancestors. Aboriginal Australians too show elevated levels of Denisovan sharing compared to most Eurasian populations, though often a bit less than Papuans. Still, far higher than you'd see in, say, Europeans or East Asians, where Denisovan traces are faint and broken. In other words, the people whose descendants would become Aboriginal Australians and Papuans didn't just pass through Denisovan territory. They met them. They lived alongside them. They had children with them, and that legacy is still carried in bodies walking around today. How do scientists actually see this, more than 40,000 or 50,000 years after the fact? The method, in principle, is simple. You sequence the genomes of many living people from many different regions. You also sequence the genomes of archaic humans where you can, Neanderthals, Denisovans. Then you look for pieces of modern genomes that look wrong, segments that are more similar to the archaic genome than to any other modern human. Those pieces are like fossils made of code, little time capsules of ancient encounters. By tracking how long these archaic segments are, how they're arranged, and how often they appear in different populations, geneticists can build models. They can estimate when interbreeding probably happened, and how many times. For Denisovan ancestry and the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, the models keep pointing south and east. Not to Siberia, where the famous cave sits, but to the warm, humid island chains of Southeast Asia. Places where DNA in bones decays fast and fossils are hard to find. Somewhere in what scientists call Wallacea, the stepping stone islands between mainland Southeast Asia and Sahul, modern humans moving out of Africa met Denisovans. Not just once either. The patterns in the DNA suggest multiple pulses of Denisovan introgression, at least 2, maybe more, involving different Denisovan populations that might have been as distinct from each other as they were from Neanderthals. A Denisovan patchwork spread across Asia, meeting different waves of emerging Homo sapiens in different times and places. One or more of those meetings involved the lineage that would become the first people of Sahul. Picture that for a moment. You're part of a small group moving slowly through tropical forest and along coastlines, island to island. You already carry the mark of the great African bottleneck. You speak a language that would be utterly alien to us, but rich and complex enough to coordinate sea crossings, hunting parties, and social alliances. You know the stars. You know the tides. And then, on some unfamiliar shore, you meet people who are human, but not quite like you. We don't know what Denisovans looked like. Their faces are shadows, reconstructed only in the broadest strokes from partial jaws and genetic hints. They might have been robust like Neanderthals with strong builds. They might have carried their own tool traditions, their own songs. What we can say is that when these two lineages met, bottleneck-forged Homo sapiens and island-dwelling Denisovans, they didn't just compete, they mixed. For a while at least, they shared life closely enough for children to be born and raised. Echoes of those children are still present in modern Aboriginal Australians and Papuans. Some of the Denisovan DNA they carry appears to have been more than just neutral baggage. In other parts of the world, we can see specific Denisovan-derived gene variants doing particular jobs. On the Tibetan plateau, a Denisovan-like version of a gene called EPAS. One helps people cope with thin air, adjusting their blood and oxygen use so they can live and work at altitudes that leave most outsiders gasping. In Papuan populations, studies have found Denisovan variants turning up in genes linked to immune function. These archaic segments are overrepresented in parts of the genome that deal with recognizing pathogens, shaping how the body responds to viruses, bacteria and parasites in tropical environments. For Aboriginal Australians, research is still catching up. The signals are more subtle, and the story is still being written. Some Denisovan-derived segments may have helped immune systems adjust to new disease landscapes as people moved through Southeast Asia into Sahul. Others might be involved in how the body processes different kinds of foods, or copes with heat, or responds to particular environmental pressures. Nothing here is absolutely settled. Many of the proposed functions are based on statistical patterns and hints of natural selection, not direct experiments. The safest thing to say is that Denisovan DNA didn't just sit quietly in the genome. Some of it seems to have been useful, shaped and retained by generations of survival. At the same time, we have to be honest about how incomplete the picture is. Tropical climates are harsh on ancient DNA. Bones rot, molecules break apart. The further you go from cold, dry caves like Denisova, the rarer intact genetic material becomes. That means our maps of Denisovan presence are drawn mostly from absence and inference. A jaw here, a tooth there, a genome from Siberia, another from the Tibetan plateau, and then a vast genetic shadow stretching across mainland Asia into island Southeast Asia and out towards Sahul. It's entirely possible that future finds in places like Sulawesi, Flores, Timor or New Guinea could upend our tidy models. A Denisovan skeleton on an Indonesian island might show a very different anatomy. Ancient DNA from a tropical cave could reveal yet another branch of Denisovan-like humans. New genomes from Aboriginal communities, where those communities choose to be involved and guide the research, could refine how much Denisovan ancestry different groups actually carry and what it does. But even with all these uncertainties, one conclusion is hard to escape. Aboriginal Australians are not at the edge of the human story. They are right at its centre. The ancestors who first crossed into Sahul were already part of a long, complicated web of encounters. They were shaped by that ancient African bottleneck you heard about earlier. They carried Neanderthal traces from meetings in the Middle East, And crucially, they bore a strong imprint of Denisovan ancestry from deep encounters in the island corridors of Southeast Asia. When we talk about modern humans meeting archaic relatives and exchanging genes, we're not talking about something that happened far away to someone else. We're talking about the direct ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians and Papuans. Their lineages record some of the most intense and enduring episodes of interbreeding with these lost cousins anywhere on Earth. That changes how we think about human evolution. The old textbook picture went something like this. Modern humans evolve in Africa, leave in a neat wave, maybe pick up a few Neanderthal genes in passing, and then fan out to fill empty continents. Simple, linear, clean. The new picture is different. It's a braid, not a line. Small populations splitting and rejoining. Ghost lineages like the Denisovans leaving fingerprints in our DNA, even when their bones have crumbled to dust. People crossing water gaps tens of thousands of years before anyone in Europe thought to sail more than a river. Knowledge, genes and technologies moving along routes that would one day become the pathways to Sahul. In that braided story, Aboriginal Australians are not late arriving isolated remnants. They are descendants of some of the earliest explorers, carrying one of the deepest and most complex records of contact with other human kinds. Their genomes are archives of ancient meetings, bottleneck survivors, Neanderthals, Denisovans, all woven into a lineage that would go on to develop some of the world's longest continuous cultural traditions. And when those ancestors finally set foot on Sahul's shores, they didn't just bring stone tools and fire. They brought this invisible cargo of ghost DNA, a legacy of deep encounters stretching back through Asia, a set of genetic experiments in immunity, metabolism and adaptation that would play out over tens of thousands of years on a continent full of marsupial giants and burning plains. To see what they did with that legacy, to see how those ancient genes, old skills and new ideas turned into technologies that rival anything happening in Ice Age Europe, we need to look much more closely at what the first Australians actually made, built and invented, long before anyone carved the first cities into stone. When archaeologists first dug deep into the shelter at Madjedbebe in Arnhem Land, they thought they knew what they were looking at. Stone Age layers, simple flakes, maybe a hearth or two, the kind of basic toolkit that, in the old story, was supposed to belong to primitive hunter-gatherers just hanging on at the edge of the world. That is not what they found. As the sediment came away centimetre by centimetre, the picture that emerged was something else entirely. More than 100,000 artifacts, not just broken rocks, but an entire technological universe, stacked in layers going down to at least 50,000 years ago, and quite possibly closer to 65. If you laid that timeline alongside Europe's, this was long before the famous painted caves of France, long before farming in the Middle East, long before anyone in most of Asia was polishing axes, and yet, buried in the oldest levels at Madjedbeb, there they were, ground-edge axe fragments. In most of Eurasia, the idea of grinding an axe head smooth and sharp on a stone surface doesn't really take off until the Holocene, after the last ice age. People there spend hundreds of thousands of years with flaked tools, sharp but rough, before someone thinks, what if we reshape the edge by grinding it, make it tougher, easier to control? At Madjedbebe, people were doing that near the very beginning of the site's history. Microscopic wear on the fragments shows they weren't just experimenting. They were using, maintaining and resharpening these ground-edge hatchets over and over. The technique appears again later at places like Gabanmung, another Arnhem land rock shelter, around 35,000 years ago. That's still Pleistocene, still Ice Age, still far ahead of the curve compared to most of the world. So if we keep calling this Stone Age, we need to be clear what kind of Stone Age we're talking about. Not crude, not stuck, not waiting for civilization to arrive. We're looking at people who, tens of thousands of years ago, were already doing something that later farmers in other continents would proudly reinvent, and axes were only part of the story. Scattered through those same early layers at Majed Beba grinding stones, heavy slabs, handheld mullahs. Under a microscope their surfaces are glossy, ground down by repeated use. In some cases, residues of plant starch still cling in the tiny pits and scratches. The analysis suggests that even in the earliest occupation phases, people were grinding seeds and other plant foods intensively. That matters, because in the old narrative, seed grinding belongs to the Neolithic revolution in the Middle East, around 10 or 12,000 years ago, when people supposedly invented agriculture, settled down, and started processing grains. But here, in northern Australia, there's evidence of regular seed grinding at least 50,000 years ago, maybe more, tens of thousands of years before the first wheat field in the Levant, long before the word farmer means anything at all. What does it look like to live that way? Imagine the end of the dry season. The country's thinning out, some foods are scarce, but there's a flush of grass seeds on particular patches of ground. Small, individually, but in huge numbers. To turn those tiny seeds into something nourishing, you need knowledge. You need to know which species are edible, which are bitter, which need roasting to break down toxins. You need tools to harvest them efficiently, and the patience to collect, dry, winnow, and grind them into flour or paste. That's not casual snacking. That's systematic plant processing. At Majid Baby, this kind of technology keeps showing up again and again through the layers, for something like 65,000 years. Grinding stones being used, worn out, replaced. Seed grinding isn't a brief experiment that fails. It's a long-term commitment to a particular way of feeding people in a difficult environment. And then there's the variety. When researchers classify the artifacts from these early Australian sites, they don't just see one or two tool types. They see whole families, hafted tools, sharp stone points fitted to wooden shafts using plant resins and sinew, edge-ground implements with carefully prepared working surfaces, tiny backed artifacts, small flakes with one edge dulled and steeply retouched so they can be glued into slots, forming composite tools, serrated cutting edges, barbed spear tips, complex projectiles. To make something like that, you have to think several steps ahead. First, you choose the right stone, one that fractures predictably. Then you remove flakes in a controlled way to get the shape you want. Maybe you heat treat the stone to improve its properties. You collect resin from particular plants at particular times of year, so it will set properly. You process animal tendons into binding material. You shape the wooden handle or spear shaft. Then you bring it all together in the right sequence, at the right temperatures, in the right proportions. That's chemistry, engineering, and design rolled into a single act. None of it works if the knowledge doesn't move between generations. A child doesn't wake up one day knowing which gum makes the best glue or which stone fractures like glass. Someone has to show them. Songs, stories, demonstrations around the fire, cultural learning repeated thousands of times across tens of thousands of years. So when we describe these early Australians as hunter-gatherers, we need to remember what those words are covering up. Hunting here doesn't mean wandering randomly with a sharp stick. It might mean using a composite spear with a finely backed stone tip, shaped on a site-specific grindstone, hafted in a resin recipe perfected over centuries. Gathering doesn't mean casually picking a few berries. It might mean mapping the flowering and fruiting cycles of dozens of plants, knowing when their seeds are ripe, when their toxins are lowest, how long they need to be roasted, how they change in a flood year versus a drought year. And some of the technologies Aboriginal people developed later on make that complexity even harder to ignore. Think of the boomerang, not the tourist trinket, the real thing. A precisely shaped aerodynamic implement tuned in curve, thickness and weight so that some will return to the thrower, while others, hunting boomerangs, are designed for straight, powerful flight. They're cut from particular parts of a tree with the natural grain and curve already in mind, then shaped and balanced so that they spin stably in the air. Understanding that takes generations of careful observation. You need to know how different woods behave, how wind and humidity change performance, how animals react, or look at the fish traps on the Barwon River at Brewarina, Bayamas Ngunu. From above they form a sweeping network of stone weirs and pools, stretching almost half a kilometre along the riverbed. Curved walls guide fish into holding ponds as water levels rise and fall. Different sections come into play at different heights, so the system works in drought and in flood. Engineers who've examined them speak of sophisticated hydrological design. Aboriginal custodians describe them as ancient, tied into law, ceremony and gatherings between many different groups. Archaeologists are still debating exact ages. There's no firm number yet. Some models suggest the current configuration may be several thousand years old, while oral histories often speak of much deeper time. What's not in doubt is the complexity of the idea, shaping a river itself into a semi-permanent food harvesting machine. Further south, on the lava flows of Bujbim in Gunditj Mara country, another kind of engineering took shape. Here, over at least 6,000 years, perhaps longer, people built an intricate aquaculture landscape. They modified natural channels in the basalt. They stacked stones to create weirs, culverts and ponds. They guided eels along these pathways, trapping and holding them so they could be harvested when needed, smoked, stored, even traded. This is not episodic foraging. It's long-term investment in infrastructure, with close attention to seasonal flows, eel life cycles, and the behaviour of water across a whole volcanic plain. It supported villages, it anchored law and identity. It was intensive, sustainable food production, embedded in story and ceremony, long before European farmers ploughed their first field in the region. Meanwhile, back at Majidbebe and other early sites, another thread runs through almost every layer. Ochre, red, yellow, sometimes purple or brown, iron-rich minerals ground into powder on the stones that still bear the scratch marks today. Some of the grinding stones carry residues of both plant and pigment use. People were, it seems, processing food and colour on the same tools, sometimes at the same time. What was the colour for? We don't know exactly. It doesn't fossilise into clear meanings. But in many Aboriginal cultures recorded in the last few centuries, ochre is used in body painting, rock art, burial rites and ceremony. It marks kinship, country, spiritual relationships. It's medicine and symbol and art all together. The fact that we find so much ochre in the very earliest dense occupation layers at Majidbebe suggests that something like this, symbolic or ritual behaviour, was already part of life from the beginning. People weren't waiting around for civilization to give them meaning. They were creating and renewing it, with colour and pattern, as soon as they arrived. When we put all of this together, the axes, the grinding stones, the composite tools, the boomerangs, the fish traps, the eel farms, the pigments, a different picture emerges. Innovation here isn't an optional extra. It's a requirement. Australia is not a gentle continent. Over the span of Aboriginal presence, climate swung from deep Ice Age cold to humid warmth. Sea levels rose more than 100 metres, drowning half of the original landmass of Sahul, and turning inland plains into the Arafura and Timor Seas. Deserts expanded and shrank. Monsoon belts shifted. Rivers changed course or vanished. To survive on a land like that for 50 or 60 plus thousand years, you can't just learn one way of living and stick to it. You need to be able to retool, to adjust hunting strategies when a prey species disappears, to change plant foods when rainfall patterns shift, to alter fire regimes when fuel loads build up or storms get stronger. Technology in that sense isn't separate from culture. It is culture. It's the remembered experiment that worked, the story about how to place a stone in a river, the song that describes which seeds to harvest after which kind of rain. From the outside, in the language of 19th century anthropology, this might all be flattened into Stone Age hunter-gatherers. From the inside, it looks more like something else. Inventors, living through ice ages and sea level rise, turning stone and wood and water into tools as subtle as anything in Ice Age Europe. Engineers of rivers and lava flows, chemists of resin and pigment, custodians of a technological tradition older than many civilizations, and still, in many places, alive. And woven through all of it, as we'll see next, is a technology that leaves almost no trace in the soil, but has lasted longer than any city wall or written alphabet. A way of storing and moving information that can carry a map, a law code, and a family tree in a single melody. Imagine you're walking. No compass, no GPS, no map in your pocket. Just open country in front of you, stretching to the horizon. Spinifex plains, stony deserts, ranges rising blue in the distance. You have to cross hundreds, maybe thousands of kilometers. You can't afford to get lost. In some stretches, if you miss a waterhole by even a few hundred meters, you die. How do you hold a whole continent in your head? In many Aboriginal cultures, the answer is simple, and not simple at all. You sing it. Songlines, sometimes called dreaming tracks or song spirals, are not just myths in the way that word is often used. They are vast interlocking networks of narrative that crisscross the Australian continent, weaving through language groups, ecosystems and skies. Each one follows the path of ancestral beings who travelled across the land in the dreaming, shaping hills, rivers, waterholes, rock formations, and the lives that depend on them. But those journeys are also something else. They're maps, not drawn in ink, sung in order, verse by verse, place by place. On some songlines, each segment of the song corresponds to a specific feature on the ground, a bend in a river, a particular kind of rock, a stand of trees, a soak where water lies under the sand. To move through that country, you don't need a diagram. You recite the song. As the melody unfolds, your body moves with it. You walk from one verse to the next, one landmark to the next, matching the remembered sequence to the world around you. If the song says there is a waterhole after the low ridge with a split boulder, you know that when you see that ridge you are close to water, whether you have been here before or not. In some traditions, the map is doubled. On the ground, the track follows hills and creeks. Above, the same path is mirrored in the night sky. The stars become waypoints. Certain constellations mark the direction of travel. Others rise or set over important sites. Learning the song isn't just memorizing words. It's learning how the earth and the sky talk to each other. Anthropologists working with Wardaman elders in Northern Australia, for instance, describe songlines that run from one major ceremonial site to another, mirrored by a trail of stars overhead. A traveller can navigate by both, the remembered lyrics tied to country and the celestial route, arching from horizon to horizon. When you step back and look at this from a distance, another picture emerges. This isn't just a story, it's an information technology. In Western history, the classic example of a sophisticated memory system is the Greek method of loci, the memory palace. You take an imagined building, place images in different rooms or along a route, and then mentally walk through it to retrieve information. It works remarkably well. People still use it to remember decks of cards, long speeches, endless lists. Songlines do something similar, but on a different scale. Instead of a palace, the building is an actual landscape, hundreds of kilometres of it. Instead of arbitrary images, the memory points are living sites, waterholes, rock faces, patches of bush medicine, stone arrangements, ceremonial grounds. And instead of storing just one kind of information, names, dates, numbers, the songs hold many layers at once: geography, law, kinship, resource rights, history, cosmology. Psychologists who study memory now talk about Aboriginal song traditions as some of the most complex mnemonic systems ever developed. Like the method of loci, they rely on structured movement through space, but they integrate knowledge into real places, visited and revisited over generations, updated as conditions change. Think about what that means for survival. A songline might tell you not only where a waterhole is, but when it can be trusted. One verse might describe how, after a certain flower blooms, water will sit clear in the rock basin for 2 moons before it turns bad. Another might mark a patch of country as dangerous in drought years, when poisonous plants flourish and game is scarce. Animal behaviour is there too. Stories remember when and where particular species travel, breed or shed. They can tell you that emu eggs are plentiful after a certain constellation appears in the dawn sky, or that a kind of fish moves inland along flooded creeks when a particular tree flowers. Fire is woven in. Songlines encode where to burn and when, which patches must be left alone, how fire can be used to open up grasslands for grazing animals without destroying the deeper structure of the ecosystem. Over thousands of years, this turns into a distributed, constantly checked system of land management. Call it a database if you like, not stored on servers but in minds, bodies and country, not accessed with a password but with song, ceremony and the responsibilities that go with them. And this information isn't static. When conditions shift, when a waterhole silts up, when a new path is cut by a flood, when an introduced species appears, the story can be refined. Elders correct younger singers. Neighbouring groups compare versions. Details that are no longer true are questioned, argued over, sometimes re-anchored in new metaphors or new sites. Built into many Aboriginal knowledge systems is a structure for quality control. Knowledge is not just owned by a single person. It sits within a network of custodians. Children are taught to listen for mistakes, to speak up if something doesn't fit what they've heard from others. Story, song and country are cross-checked across generations. That may help explain something that at first glance seems almost unbelievable. In coastal regions around Australia, there are oral traditions that describe shorelines that no longer exist, stories of hunting grounds now underwater, of walking across what are today open seas, to islands that can only be reached by boat, of cliffs that were once inland now being pounded by waves. When geologists and sea level specialists map how the coast changed after the last ice age, how sea levels rose more than 100 metres between about 13,000 and 7,000 years ago, they find that many of these stories line up startlingly well with the drowned landscape. In one case off the northwest coast, a song remembered by Yinjibarndi people describes a series of fresh water sources along a path that now lies more than 14 metres under the ocean, over 100 kilometres from the modern shoreline. Sonar mapping of the seabed has identified depressions and channels in the right places, possible ancient springs and water holes. Does that prove an unbroken oral chain for 10,000 years or more? Not beyond all doubt. Some researchers are enthusiastic, others more cautious. Oral traditions can evolve, combine, adapt, but at the very least, it suggests that, under the right cultural conditions, complex geographic information can be carried in story across hundreds of generations with remarkable fidelity. And geography is only one layer of what travels this way. Songlines are also lore. They tell how ancestral beings establish the boundaries of different countries, where one group's responsibilities end and another's begin. They lay out rules of conduct, who can take what from where, which water must never be fouled, which species can be hunted in which season, how visitors must announce themselves when crossing into someone else's land. Kinship obligations are encoded too. A song may explain which skin groups can marry, which relationships are taboo, how to behave towards your mother's brother or your father's sister, what must be done to settle a dispute between certain categories of relatives. The story isn't just entertaining, it's a legal code, sung into being. As you travel a songline, you are not moving through empty wilderness. You're walking through a network of jurisdictions, responsibilities, and histories. Each bend in the track comes with agreements. Each campsite is also, in a sense, a clause in a treaty between people, land, ancestors, and neighbouring groups. For a long time, outside observers looked at Aboriginal societies and wrote, "No writing." From that absence they leapt to another conclusion. No history, no law in our sense, no complex information storage. But writing is only one way to externalize memory. Ink on paper, marks on clay, glyphs on stone. Songlines represent a different design solution to the same problem: how to move large amounts of critical information across time and space without losing too much along the way. Instead of putting knowledge into objects that can burn, rot, or be forgotten in a box, they put it into places and relationships that people are bound to revisit, physically and emotionally, again and again. The technology here isn't an alphabet. It's a carefully structured fusion of melody, rhythm, narrative, landscape, ceremony, and social obligation. A system resilient enough to outlast empires, cities, and languages. A system that, in some cases, seems to reach back to a time when the coastline lay far out on what is now the continental shelf before rising seas drowned half of Sahul. So when we picture Aboriginal Australians on the move across their country, across deserts, along rivers, from coast to inland plain, we shouldn't imagine them wandering at random through an unmarked land. They are moving along lines of song that tie them to ancestors, neighbours, and places they may never have seen but already know by heart. In their heads and on their tongues they carry something as powerful in its own way as any scroll or tablet, an operating system for a continent. And as the land itself began to change, ice sheets melting, seas rolling in, lakes shrinking, deserts breathing in and out, that operating system did something else that written records rarely manage over such spans of time. It adapted, which is what it would have to do on a continent where the edges of the world were about to drown, where whole regions would vanish beneath the sea, and where the people who had sung their way across one supercontinent, Sahul, would have to rethink their maps, their stories, and their futures all over again. The same minds that could turn a continent into a songbook did something else, equally strange and beautiful. They painted it, not just occasionally, not as a rare burst of inspiration. Across Australia, in escarpments and caves and overhangs, there are tens of thousands of rock art sites, so many that no one has counted them all. Some tucked away in gorges only reachable by careful climbing, others facing open plains, visible from far off like signs on a highway, and they're old. How old depends on where you look and how you measure. Directly dating paint is difficult. Often, scientists have to date what lies over the top of the art, mineral crusts or the tiny mud nests of wasps that built their homes partly across a painted line. In the Kimberley, in northwest Australia, a team did just that. They dated wasp nests that overlay a 2-metre-long ochre kangaroo painted on a rock ceiling. Those nests came back with ages around 17,500 years. The painting beneath must be at least that old. It may be older. Nearby, delicate human-like figures known as guion or kujon, slender bodies, elaborate hair or headdresses, tasselled belts, cluster mostly between about 12 and 13,000 years ago, with some panels hinting at deeper antiquity. underlying more roughly drawn animals harder to date, may push the regional tradition back toward 40,000 years, though those estimates are still being tested. Further east, in Arnhem Land, rock shelters show occupation layers going back 40, maybe 50,000 years. Nawala Gabanmang, one of these places, is like a sandstone forest turned into a cathedral, a natural hall of pillars and ceiling, carved by wind and time, then reshaped by people who carefully removed and rearranged blocks of stone to open the interior. Everywhere you look there, the rock is painted. Red ochres, yellows, whites, blacks. Figures overlap figures. Animals stride across older animals. Human forms, spirits, fish, wallabies, hands. The ceiling is a palimpsest of lives and stories, built up over at least 20, maybe closer to 30,000 years of repainting and renewal. Excavations at the floor show people used this shelter as far back as 40,000+ years ago. The art, too, is not a single Ice Age moment, but a continuous practice stretching deep into time. If you're used to hearing about ancient art from Europe, you might think first of places like Lascaux or Altamira. Those caves, with their bison and horses, rightly captured the world's imagination. They showed that Ice Age people were not brutish, but capable of extraordinary sensitivity and skill. For a long time the story stopped there. European art, old, sophisticated, mysterious. Everything else, late, derivative, or primitive. But when you place Europe beside Australia, the comparison begins to look very different. The famous European caves are special, partly because they are rare. A few extraordinary sites sealed by chance, with a burst of art concentrated in relatively narrow windows of time. The cultures that made them vanished long ago. Their languages are lost. Their stories can only be guessed at. Australia is almost the opposite. Instead of a handful of decorated caves, there is a continent-wide mosaic of rock art provinces. Kimberley figures, Arnhem Land X-ray and dynamic scenes, Central Australian engravings pecked into stone, Tasmanian motifs on shelters exposed to harsh southern weather, coastal galleries with fish and sea creatures, inland panels of patterned circles and lines. Instead of a single period, there are overlapping sequences that run from the deep Pleistocene through to the last few centuries, in some regions right up to the present. And crucially, there are still people whose responsibilities, languages and ceremonies are tied to these images. Some elders can stand before certain figures and say, "That's this ancestor. That's this part of the dreaming track. That's the story that tells us how to behave here, what we can and cannot do, who may speak for this place." The art is not a mute relic. It is embedded in a living web of law, narrative and country. And, to outsiders, the first thing that catches the eye is often style. In Arnhem Land, there are paintings where animals are shown in X-ray, not only their bodies, but their bones and organs. Fish with spines carefully rendered, lungfish with inner structures picked out, turtles whose shells are transparent, revealing hearts and gut. You could read this as simple decoration. You could also see it as a visual textbook, a way of teaching anatomy, but also of signalling that knowledge doesn't stop at the surface, that there is an inside to everything, a hidden pattern, a spiritual dimension, a law. Other panels show dynamic figures, people in motion, spears drawn back, boomerangs raised, dancers mid-step, bodies bending as if caught between frames of a film. Some wear headdresses or carry ritual objects still recognized in ceremonies today. And then there are the layers of time. In several parts of northern Australia, you can stand in front of a wall and, with guidance, read a sequence that runs from the age of Megafauna to the age of global contact. Low down, or lurking under more recent paint, are large animals that may represent species now extinct. Giant kangaroos, heavy-bodied creatures that match no modern type exactly. Higher up, there are more familiar kangaroos and wallabies, barramundi and other fish, crocodiles and birds, all portrayed with close attention to habit and form. Still later, ships appear. Tall sails, multiple masts, or praus from Makassar in Indonesia, with characteristic hulls, recalling centuries of tripang, sea cucumber, fishing, and trade along Australia's northern coasts. Even guns are there, and men in unfamiliar dress. They mark the arrival of Europeans, of devastating change, of new laws and violent conflicts. On a single rock face you can trace a history that encompasses Ice Age ecology, seafaring contact with Asia, and colonization from Europe. Art here is not separated into history paintings, religious painting, and natural history illustration. It is all of those at once. Dreaming beings, ancestral creators whose actions shape the landscape, are shown alongside ordinary animals and human scenes. But ordinary does not mean trivial. A hunting tableau can encode lore. Who's allowed to hunt, when, and with which technique? A figure with specific body paint and headdress may signify a ceremony that reaffirms land rights or the obligations between kin groups. In some traditions, a spiral or concentric circle symbol can stand for a waterhole, a camp, a meeting place. The same form can also mark a point in a songline, a clause in a lore story, a place where certain foods must never be taken. The image is a condensed diagram of geography, memory, and ethics. Colour itself carries meaning. The red and yellow ochres that make many of these paintings glow are not just pigments. They are substances with their own stories and powers. Certain ochre sources are famous across huge distances, known for a particular shade or shimmer. At sites like Wilgie in Western Australia, mining traces show that people extracted ochre on a large scale for thousands of years. When archaeologists analyse the chemistry of ochre pieces found far from such quarries, they sometimes match them back to their original source. In some cases, this implies movement over hundreds of kilometres. Not just one heroic journey, but established routes of exchange. Ochre travelled as part of ceremony and trade. With it travelled songs, dances, spouses, news and obligations. A red streak on a body, or a red figure on a wall might literally embody connections to distant people and far-off country. From a Western perspective, it's tempting to separate all this into categories. Art over here, religion over there, map here, chronicle there. The rock shelters of Australia ignore those boundaries. They show a way of thinking in which the same gesture, dipping a finger into ochre, outlining a hand, tracing the curve of a kangaroo's back, is simultaneously an act of devotion, of teaching, of remembering, of asserting rights, of recording an event. Consider how unusual that is in global terms. The earliest known cave art in Indonesia, hand stencils and animals perhaps 60 or 70,000 years old, shows that humans across this wider region were marking stone at very deep dates. Europe has its bison, lions and horses painted maybe 30 to 40,000 years ago. Sahul, the ancient landmass that included Australia and New Guinea, joins this story with its own early traces of pigment use at sites like Majed Bebe, and with rock art traditions that may reach back 40,000 years or more. Even if the oldest layers are hard to pin down with current methods, what sets Aboriginal Australian art apart is not a claim to be the first in some global league table. It's continuity. From Pleistocene shelters to recent bark paintings, from X-ray kangaroos to depictions of steamships, many of these traditions form an unbroken thread. The same country, held by descendants of the people who painted it. The same songlines still sung. The same beings still present in story and lore, even if the world around them has changed beyond recognition. When you stand, if you are invited, if it is appropriate to stand, beneath a painted ceiling like the one at Nawala Gabarmang, you are not in a museum. You're in a room where the walls have been in conversation with human minds for tens of thousands of years. Each generation has added strokes, refreshed fading lines, sometimes painted new stories over old, not in contempt, but in continuity. The old image is not erased, it is absorbed, its power taken into the new layer. Like songlines, the art adapts. As animals go extinct, new species appear, neighbours arrive by sea, strangers come with guns, the imagery shifts to accommodate the altered world. But at its core, the same work is being done, tying people to place, to ancestors, to each other, and to times so deep that our usual words, history, memory, feel thin. For a long time, people looking in from the outside saw these paintings and thought, decoration, primitive superstition, frozen remnants of a culture that never changed. The evidence on the rocks, the wasp nest dates, the overlapping styles, the depictions of contact and catastrophe, the continuing use of ochre in ceremony, shows something else. A continent-scale art tradition, at least as ancient in its roots as the famous caves of Europe, far more extensive in its reach, and, perhaps uniquely, still entangled with the living descendants of its first makers. An art that is not just about what the world looks like, but about how it holds together. Follow one line of ochre or pearl shell, and the illusion of an isolated continent begins to fall apart. Imagine standing at a rock shelter far inland in red desert country, no sea in sight. Yet among the artifacts on the floor, archaeologists find tiny fragments of shell that can be chemically matched to coasts hundreds, even thousands of kilometres away. At other sites, an axe head from one kind of stone turns up in a landscape where that rock simply doesn't exist. Sometimes, with careful analysis, you can trace it back to a single quarry, a single mountain or ridge where that stone is found. In southeastern Australia, places like Mount William became famous long before anyone wrote their names on a map. There people quarried a prized greenstone for axes, not finished axes usually, but blanks, rough-shaped pieces carried away to be ground and polished elsewhere. Those blanks moved outwards in widening circles, traded and gifted along well-known routes. Some travelled hundreds of kilometres. One axe studied in a museum collection seems to have journeyed close to 1,000. Across the continent, similar stories repeat. Ochre from rich quarries such as Wilgimia in Western Australia appears in context far beyond walking distance. Engraved pearl shells from the far northwest, shimmering incised with designs, turn up more than 3,000 kilometres from their source. Baler shells from Cape York in the far northeast are found deep in the interior, and then even farther south, carried along like bright curved messages from the sea. From a distance, these objects look like trinkets. Up close, they reveal something else. A web. Lines of movement connecting deserts to coasts, plains to ranges, river valleys to high plateaus. People knew who lived over the horizon, and the next horizon beyond that, not as vague rumours, but as kin, allies, trading partners, ceremonial companions. Along these routes things moved. Pituri, a strongly psychoactive native tobacco, specialised stones, shells, ochre. But ideas and obligations moved as well. News of drought or plenty, songs, marriage arrangements, ritual knowledge that had to be carried to the right place at the right time by the right people. In many parts of the world, when archaeologists begin to see long-distance trade, they treat it as a sign that societies are becoming more complex, more civilised. In Australia, early outsiders often missed the pattern completely. They saw small camps, temporary shelters, people moving with the seasons and assumed isolation. A scatter of possessions, but no sense of the roots that had brought some of those materials from so far away. If you could see the same landscape as a network diagram, lines glowing where paths and obligations ran, you would see something very different. a continent knitted together. And this network was not one thing. One of the most persistent myths about Aboriginal Australia is that there was a single Aboriginal culture, a kind of uniform way of life, stretched thinly over a huge area. At the time of European invasion, reality looked nothing like that. There were, by careful linguistic counts, on the order of 250 distinct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages across the continent and nearby islands. Some estimates climb higher when dialects and poorly documented varieties are included, perhaps 300 or more. Each of those languages is tied to a people, to named countries, to particular tracts of land and sea. Within languages there are clans and local groups, each with its own totems, songs, responsibilities. The difference between two Aboriginal languages can be as great as the difference between French and Russian, or between English and Hindi. You cannot simply walk from one territory into another and expect to be understood. The diversity is astonishing. Northern coasts speak non-Pama Nyungan tongues with structures and sounds not found in the southeast. Much of the rest of the continent shares, at deeper time depths, a vast family called Pama Nyungan, with branches that spread across thousands of kilometres, their relatedness still being teased apart by linguists. To a coloniser who came ashore, learned a few words from one group, and then met another community speaking something quite different, this could be baffling. Some early writers simply flatten the difference. The natives' language. But from within, this mosaic was entirely normal. You knew your own language. You probably knew at least some of your neighbours' tongues, especially if marriage or ceremony linked you. You might sing songs that contained words from further away, preserved as the language of an ancestor or a lore story. Multilingualism was not exotic. It was basic survival in a world where social and ceremonial networks ran across linguistic borders. If you picture Aboriginal Australia as one culture, one language, one way of life, you will miss almost everything that matters. You will also miss how much things changed. Another old myth says that when Europeans arrived, they found a people frozen in time. Stone tools, fire stick farming, no metals, no agriculture in the old world sense, and therefore, the story goes, no progress for tens of thousands of years. The archaeological record disagrees. When you lay out collections of tools, food remains, hearths and camp structures from different periods, you don't see a flat line. You see waves. In some regions, early assemblages are dominated by relatively large stone implements. Then, thousands of years later, you begin to see a proliferation of tiny backed blades and points. Microliths, carefully shaped and often set into shaft to make composite tools. Later again, in some areas, those microliths become less common and other forms take their place. Grinding technology, the use of grindstones to process seeds and tubers, appears early in places like Majid Bebe in Arnhem Land, then waxes and wanes in prominence in different epochs and regions, probably tracking shifts in diet and climate. Fire management too shows signs of being dynamic. People did not simply burn the bush in one unchanging way. In some phases, charcoal and pollen records suggest fine-grained mosaics of burnt and unburnt country, supporting an abundance of game and edible plants. In others, perhaps under pressure from climate fluctuations or social disruption, patterns change, burn intervals lengthen or shorten. The mix of species in the landscape adjusts in response. On coasts, there is a long-term story of increasingly intensive use of marine resources, shell middens building up over millennia. Then, in some areas during the last couple of thousand years, new technologies like fish hooks appearing in the archaeological layers. Inland, especially in arid zones, you can see shifts in mobility. Some periods show high turnover of campsites, a very light footprint spread thinly over wide areas. Others show more repeated use of certain water places, perhaps as people negotiated access during harsher phases of climate or as social landscapes changed. None of this looks like stasis. It looks like what it is, millennia of continuous experiment, and underneath that diversity, there are regional specializations as refined as anything in the ancient world. In the deserts and semi-arid heart of the continent, survival depends on water. Desert peoples developed expertise in finding, protecting and storing it that can look almost supernatural to outsiders. Soakages hidden under sand, rock holes covered or disguised to keep them clean and safe, wells dug and maintained for generations, knowledge of when a certain clay pan will hold water after particular rains and when it will not. Travel that was not random wandering. It followed a carefully remembered sequence of water sources and seasonal foods, often laid out in songlines that doubled as route maps, mythologies, and lore. On the coasts and along big rivers, different specializations evolved. Bark and dugout canoes, nets, traps, fish weirs, hooks fashioned from shell or bone appear in different combinations. Some communities developed intricate tidal fish traps, stone arrangements that caught fish as the water fell. Others became experts in hunting dugong and turtle, or in nighttime spearing of fish by torchlight. In the far south, across Bass Strait before rising seas cut Tasmania off from the mainland, people adapted to cold, sometimes near glacial conditions. As the island became isolated, some mainland technologies, like the use of the spear thrower, faded out there, while other practices continued or intensified. The result, viewed through the narrow lens of European expectations, was sometimes misread as backward. In reality, it was a local solution to local constraints, dense knowledge of shellfish beds, marsupial behaviour, and fire in a cold, wet landscape where resources and materials were not the same as on the mainland. Northern coasts tell yet another story, one that reaches beyond the continent entirely. For centuries before British colonisation, probably from at least the 1700s, and possibly earlier, sailors from what is now Indonesia sailed south in wooden praus to harvest trepang, or sea cucumber, from the rich shallows off northern Australia. These Macassan fishermen did not merely anchor offshore and vanish again. They made camps. They boiled and dried the trepang for trade into Chinese markets. And they traded with the Aboriginal communities whose countries they were working in, especially Yolngu people in Arnhem Land, but also other northern groups. In exchange for access and labour, Macassans offered metal tools, cloth, rice, alcohol, tobacco. They left vast cooking hearths, shards of pottery, the seeds of tamarind trees that still grow near some old campsites. They likely shared techniques for building dugout canoes and working iron. Words from their language slipped into local vocabularies. Terms for money, for boats, even for white people, later applied to Europeans. Rock art in the north shows their distinctive prows with tripod masts and sails. Songs remember them. Some clans still hold stories of Macassan partners and ancestors, of the sudden end of this trade when a new colonial government in the south banned foreign trepang fleets in the early 1900s. None of this fits the picture of a sealed, untouched world. Instead, it reveals Aboriginal societies actively negotiating external contact, weighing risks and benefits, absorbing some elements, resisting others, and embedding these encounters into their own lore and story cycles. So where did the idea of a timeless, unchanging Aboriginal Australia come from? Not from the ground. Not from the artefacts, the shifting toolkits, the evolving fire practices, the evidence of long-distance exchange. It came from the brief, disrupted glimpse that colonizers allowed themselves. By the time most European observers began to take notes, introduced diseases had already torn through many communities. Old networks were frayed. Sacred sites had been desecrated. Law holders killed or displaced. Land that had supported intricate seasonal movements was fenced, mined, ploughed. Looking at the aftermath, some outsiders mistook damage for origin. They assumed that what they saw was how things had always been. A people without history, as some 19th century writers claimed. Static. The deeper record tells another story. A continent whose first peoples arrived at least 50 to 60,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, and then spent tens of millennia not in suspended animation, but in motion. Languages splitting and diverging, trade networks rising, falling, rerouting, technologies appearing, spreading, sometimes being abandoned, fire regimes tuned to changing climates, external contacts woven in at the edges, not isolated, not static. A long, intricate conversation between land and people, still ongoing when the ships from far away finally appeared over the horizon. To see how deep that conversation between land and people really goes, you have to wind the clock back to a time when the continent itself was a different shape. Roughly 26,000 years ago, the last ice age reached its peak. Glaciers locked up so much water in distant parts of the world that sea levels around Australia dropped by more than 100 metres. If you could have flown over the region then, you wouldn't have seen Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania as three separate places. You would have seen one vast landmass, Sahul. Coastlines stretched far beyond where the waves break today. The Arafura Sea, the Torres Strait, much of the floor beneath the Great Barrier Reef, dry land. Wide plains laced with rivers and lagoons where now there is only blue. By some estimates, that Ice Age Sahul was up to 40% larger than the continent you see on a modern map. But larger did not mean easier. Australia in the last glacial maximum was colder, yes, but more importantly much drier. The great deserts and semi-arid zones pushed outward. Dune fields advanced, lakes shrank or vanished. In many inland regions, water became not just a challenge, but a constant limiting force. People had been here for tens of thousands of years by this point. This was not a fledgling population. It was a web of communities with languages, songlines, law. When the climate tightened, they did not simply give up, they shifted. Archaeologists and paleoecologists talk about refugia, patches of country that stay relatively productive when everything around them becomes harsh. High rainfall pockets in eastern Queensland, sheltered valleys in the southeast, certain ranges and coasts where rainfall patterns and geology conspired to keep water flowing and plants growing. As the Ice Age deepened, people moved. Not a single panicked migration, but many small, local recalibrations. Camps that had been used every year might be visited less often or abandoned. Routes between waterholes became lifelines rather than options. Groups gravitated toward those refuges where rivers still ran, and woodland or rainforest clung on. The diet changed too. In some areas, grinding stones become more common in the archaeological record, suggesting an increased reliance on hard-to-process seeds and tubers when larger, easily hunted animals grew scarce. Elsewhere, there are signs of more intensive hunting of smaller game, lizards, birds, even large rodents, each requiring its own set of techniques, traps, and stories. Through all of this, the social fabric had to hold. Those long-distance networks of trade and kinship did not vanish when water became scarce. If anything, they mattered more. In hard times, knowing who you could visit, who might share a waterhole or a patch of good country, was the difference between life and death. Songlines that mapped routes between places also mapped obligations. Who could come? Who had rights to speak for a waterhole? Who had to ask permission? The Ice Age in that sense was not just an environmental test. It was a test of law. And then, gradually, the direction of change reversed. Around 19,000 years ago, the great ice sheets far away began to melt. Temperatures crept up. Glaciers thinned and retreated. The water they released had to go somewhere. It went into the seas. Over the next 10 to 12,000 years, global sea level rose by more than 120 metres. not in a smooth, gentle line, but in pulses and surges. Some centuries would have brought relatively little change. Others may have seen the shoreline lurch inland by meters in a single human lifetime. On the exposed shelves around Sahul, that meant the world literally shrank. Those broad northern plains, now under the Arafura Sea, slowly filled. The land bridge to New Guinea narrowed, then broke. The great drowned valley that we now call the Great Barrier Reef began to flood, reef building following behind. Low-lying country along what is now the southern and western coast slipped beneath the waves. Bass Strait, which had for so long been a grassy corridor linking the far south to the mainland, became an estuary, then an arm of the sea. By around 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, Tasmania was an island. For Aboriginal societies, this was the second climate crisis in a row. The first had been about dryness and cold. The second was about loss. Entire territories, low, flat plains rich in game and plant foods, disappeared. Campsites that had been used for generations found themselves suddenly too close to the encroaching water, then under it. Old paths became sandbars, then channels, then open sea. What does that do to a culture built on place? We can't ask the people who lived through it directly, but we can listen to their descendants, and we can read the stories they have carried. Across many coastal regions of Australia, Aboriginal communities hold narratives of a time when the sea was lower, stories of walking out to what are now islands, of rivers that once flowed where there is only salt water, of ancestral beings whose camps and fireplaces now lie under the waves. In some cases, these aren't vague statements like, "Long ago the sea was different." They're detailed. On the northeast coast, the Yidiniji people have a name for Fitzroy Island that translates, in one interpretation, as the lower arm of a once continuous headland. Geological reconstructions show that headland was last a single piece of land when sea level was about 30 metres lower than today, roughly 10,000 years ago. Linguists and geoscientists carefully comparing dozens of such stories with independent sea level curves have argued that some of these oral traditions likely encode real coastal changes that happened between about 13 and 7,000 years ago. Not everyone agrees on the precise time depths. Some scholars caution that stories always evolve, that matching a narrative to a specific date can be more art than science. But even if you take the most cautious view, you are still looking at conservatively 7,000 years of remembered environmental change, hundreds of generations telling and retelling where the shoreline used to be. Alongside these memories, there must have been upheaval. As rising seas drowned coastal plains, people moved inland. Groups that had hunted and gathered in what are now submerged estuaries, lagoons, and river mouths found themselves on new coasts with different tides, new fish, different shellfish beds. Others, dispossessed of their old countries by the sea itself, would have had to negotiate access to already occupied lands. Territories had to be rethought, boundaries redrawn, law adapted to a world with less land but, in many places, richer marine resources. You can see hints of this in the archaeological record. As the Holocene, the current warm period, settles in, some coasts show an explosion of shell middens, great accumulations of discarded shells from repeated visits to the same spots. In certain regions, fishhooks and other specialised fishing gear appear in the last few thousand years, marking a turn to new techniques as shorelines stabilise and people learn the rhythms of newly formed estuaries and reefs. Inland, where populations may have been compressed by the shrinking of the continental shelf, sites suggest more intensive use of certain water sources and productive patches of country. Social rules about sharing and access would have had to keep pace, and yet, through all of this, there is continuity. The languages spoken along many coasts today can be traced back, in family trees, to ancestors who were also living by the sea thousands of years ago, even if that sea lay further out. Ceremonial responsibilities for reefs, headlands, islands and sandbars are still held by the descendants of people who first watched those features emerge as the ocean rose. From an outside perspective, it can be tempting to treat this as background scenery. Climate changes, people adjust, of course they do. But when you put the timescales side by side, something else comes into focus. The ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders arrived on Sahul at least 50 to 60,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. Since then, they have not only survived, but maintained cultural lineages through an ice age that turned much of the continent into a drier, more hostile place. A post-glacial sea level rise that erased vast tracts of their country and turned one continent into 3 separate landmasses. Local swings in rainfall, vegetation and fauna that forced repeated reinvention of subsistence, technology and law. Most human societies that we routinely call ancient, Mesopotamia, Egypt, classical China, Greece, rose and fell within a few thousand years, often collapsing under stresses far less dramatic than the drowning of half a continent's coastal plains. Here you have populations who absorbed that level of change not once but multiple times, and who kept the thread of story going long enough that some of those changes may still echo in songs and place names today. This is not the story of a people without history. It is the story of perhaps the most extraordinary long-term survival experiment humans have ever run, staying put, adapting in place, while the world around you shifts from Ice Age supercontinent to the coastlines we recognise now. And that raises a final question. If this is what the land remembers, and what its first peoples have carried through tens of thousands of years of upheaval, who gets to tell that story, and how? When scientists say 60 to 65,000 years, it sounds dramatic. Headlines call it a revolution in our understanding. Old timelines are torn up, textbooks are rewritten, there are press conferences, grant announcements, arguments in academic journals about luminescence dating and sampling strategies. But for many Aboriginal people, this isn't a shock, it's a footnote. Their stories have been saying, all along, something much simpler and much harder to translate into a neat number on a graph. We have always been here. Not always, in the sense of a start date you can pin to a lab result, but always in the sense that country, ancestors and people are part of a single unfolding. In many traditions, the beings who shape the rivers and mountains are the same beings whose laws are sung today. There is no chapter break where humans suddenly arrive from somewhere else. From that perspective, Western science is not the moment truth appears. It is one more latecomer voice, finally beginning to listen to what the land and its custodians have been saying. That doesn't make the science unimportant. It does change what we think it's doing. When a lab report nudges the first arrival date from 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, it's not just an abstract correction. It lands in a world of politics, court cases, mining leases and cultural hurt. Because in Australia, deep time is not neutral. For much of the 20th century, anthropologists and officials talked about Aboriginal Australians as if they were recent arrivals, frozen at an early stage of human development, primitive, Stone Age, without agriculture, without history. That language did work in the world. If you can convince yourself that a people are latecomers, or that their culture is shallow in time, it becomes easier to imagine that taking their land is not really taking something ancient. You can tell yourself you're stepping into an empty space, or at worst a lightly sketched one. So when archaeologists first began to find dates pushing Aboriginal presence back beyond 40,000 years, then 50, then, at some sites, close to 65, those numbers were never just numbers. They were challenges to an old comforting story. They still are. Who benefits from an older date? In one sense, everyone who cares about accurate history. But in a more concrete way, deep, well-documented antiquity can strengthen calls for heritage protection, for World Heritage listings, for native title recognition. It makes it harder for governments or companies to pretend that a place is just dirt over a resource. At the same time, you can find commentators, lobbyists, sometimes even scholars, who are surprisingly invested in keeping the numbers conservative. At least 50,000 years starts to sound safer, more cautious, more compatible with economic plans, which brings us to a rocky shelter in Arnhem Land, Majid Bebe. If you've followed popular science news over the last decade, you've probably heard that name. It's often introduced as Australia's oldest known site, with layers that some teams have dated to about 65,000 years ago. Those oldest levels contain things you've already met in this story: grinding stones, edge-ground axes, pigments, possibly used for body decoration or rock art. If those dates are right, people sheltering under Majid Bebe's overhang were using sophisticated toolkits and symbolic materials at a time when much of Eurasia was only just starting to see similar complexity. But Majid Bebe is not just a clock buried in the ground. It sits on Mirarr country in the Alligator Rivers region, in the orbit of Kakadu National Park, and a long, bitter history of uranium mining proposals and resistance. For the Mirarr people, represented by the Gunjami Aboriginal Corporation, this is not an abstract landscape. It is home, law, story, decisions about where archaeologists dig, how they interpret what they find, and how those findings are used in public debate are bound up with decisions about who has authority on that country. When researchers announce very early dates for Majid Bebe, some other archaeologists questioned the methods. They pointed to the possibility of disturbance in the sediments, roots, termite activity, maybe moving younger artifacts downwards. They argued for a more cautious, at least 50,000 years, until the evidence was rock solid. That scientific caution is not in itself sinister. Good science worries about error. But in the Alligator Rivers, those debates do not float free. They unfold alongside arguments about mining approvals, about the strength of cultural claims, about how heritage legislation should treat a site that might be not just very old, but among the earliest human occupations on the continent. If you are a Mirarr elder, watching companies make plans for your land, you will notice which voices in the media emphasize uncertainty, which highlight the deep antiquity, and what those emphases are used to justify. That is why, in recent years, there has been a push not just to study Aboriginal pasts, but to change who is doing the studying and who decides what questions are asked. In the same region as Majid Bebe, new archaeological projects are being set up as genuinely co-designed. Traditional owner organisations like Gunjami and neighbours such as the Manila Car are not simply consulted, they are partners. They choose which places to investigate. They determine what can be published, what should remain restricted, how discoveries feed into their own land management plans. Aboriginal rangers lead field trips on country. Elders sit in camp with archaeologists, stories and stratigraphy weaving together. When papers come out, traditional owners appear not as informants, but as co-authors and co-managers of heritage. This is part of a broader shift across Australia. Rock art recording projects, like those at Marrawonga in Queensland or in the Kimberley, are increasingly run with traditional owner direction at every stage. New training centres are being built to prepare archaeologists to work in the resource sector under Indigenous governance, so that heritage surveys for mines or infrastructure are not tick-box exercises, but real negotiations about value, risk and respect. Under this model, the question how old is this site is still important, but it sits alongside others. What does this place mean to the people whose country it is? Which stories can be told publicly and which Truth, and can now validate or correct dreaming stories. It is that more researchers are recognizing those stories as a different kind of truth, with their own tests, their own internal checks, their own forms of precision. When you set the two side by side, something powerful happens. Scientific dating can show that a rock shelter has been occupied for at least 50 or 60,000 years. Oral histories can show how that place fits into a network of responsibilities that still matters now. Genetics can trace ancient voyages to Sahul and high levels of Denisovan ancestry in Aboriginal and Papuan peoples. Songlines can map the same voyages in terms of ancestral paths and lore. You don't have to force them to agree on every detail. You can let them speak to each other. And when they do, the old colonial picture of Aboriginal Australians as primitive latecomers, stuck on the fringes of the human story, collapses. In its place, a different image comes into focus. A people whose ancestors were among the earliest ocean-going navigators. A continent where ground-edge axes, complex fire management, and enduring information systems like Songlines appeared tens of thousands of years before many so-called centres of civilization took shape elsewhere. A continuous lineage that has absorbed ice ages, drowned coasts and invasion, and still holds to stories that may reach back to the last great sea level rise. This isn't just academic pride. How a society imagines its first peoples shapes everything from school curricula to constitutional debates, from museum displays to how children see themselves. When Aboriginal kids grow up hearing that their ancestors were among the planet's oldest innovators, stewards of country with histories stretching back further than any pyramid or palace, it offers a different ground to stand on than the old caricatures of wandering primitives. When non-Indigenous Australians grow up with that same understanding, it becomes harder to treat Aboriginal voices as marginal, or to imagine that sovereignty is a matter that was settled in a few dusty treaties or proclamations. The deep past, in that sense, is not over. It is part of the argument about who this place belongs to, and what belonging even means. And if all of this has changed how we think about one continent on the edge of the old maps, it leaves a final thought hanging in the dark. If Aboriginal Australia was never what outsiders assumed, if it was older, more dynamic, more inventive, what else about the human story might we have gotten wrong? What other long threads are still waiting quietly to be followed? The story you've just drifted through began, in a way, with a mistake. Not a small mistake, like a misread date or a misplaced artifact. A big one. The old colonial story said that Aboriginal Australians were late arrivals, sitting at the edge of the world unchanged, Stone Age, waiting for someone else's history to arrive by ship. Over the last few decades, that picture has cracked. Dates from Majid Bebe and other sites pushed human presence in northern Australia back beyond 50,000 years, perhaps towards 60 or even 65,000. Genetic work on thousands of modern genomes began to converge on the same deep time frame, hinting at deliberate sea crossings by the ancestors of today's Aboriginal and Papuan peoples, moving along at least two routes into Sahul. At the same time, those early layers refused to look simple. seed-grinding stones worn smooth over tens of millennia, ground-edge axes appearing earlier here than anywhere else we know, pigments carried, crushed and carefully prepared, evidence that people were not just enduring a harsh continent, but actively shaping it with fire, with story, with lore. The more closely researchers looked, especially when they listened to traditional owners on country, the less sense primitive made as a description of anything. Instead, another pattern came into view, a continent peopled by expert navigators who crossed open water tens of thousands of years before sail or bronze, a web of songlines encoding geography, ecology and relationship in melodies that can outlast stone monuments, trade routes moving ochre, shells, tools and stories across vast distances, language families blossoming, splitting, recombining, reflecting countless decisions about identity and alliance, all of it threaded through ice ages, rising and falling seas, megafauna extinctions and eventually invasion and colonization. Not a static culture, but one of the world's longest-running experiments in adaptation and continuity. What does that mean, not just for Australia, but for all of us? It suggests that civilization is not only a matter of cities, writing and metal. It can also mean a society that learns to live with a place for 60,000 years without destroying it. A knowledge system that can remember drowned coastlines and ancient fires. A law that ties people to country so tightly that, even after centuries of dispossession, those connections can still be felt, sung and defended. In that light, Aboriginal histories are not a footnote to a global story that happened somewhere else. They are one of its main threads. They show that innovation can be quiet, cumulative, carried in voice and practice rather than marble and steel, and the story is still moving. New excavations, reanalyzed collections, refined genetic models, and most importantly, new collaborations with Aboriginal communities will keep reshaping what we think we know. Some dates may be revised, some bold claims will soften, others will grow stronger. If you'd like to keep following those threads with me, you can. If this helped you relax or made you curious, you can tap like or subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into deep time. If you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and which part of this story stayed with you. There is also an optional channel membership for those who want to support this work more directly. It's never expected, but always appreciated. For now, let your thoughts go back to that first shoreline of Sahul. Dark water, starlight, the soft thud of a canoe on wet sand. Feet step out onto a land that will become country, threaded with paths of ancestors, songs and lore. Generation after generation through shifting climates and rising seas, that thread is carried hand to hand, voice to voice, down to the present moment where you lie, listening. Somewhere far back people are still landing. Somewhere far forward their descendants are still singing. The longest story ever told has not ended. You're simply resting for a while inside one of its sentences,